Yeah, I was born in 1963 in Atlanta when Georgia was Jim Crow state. And I don't know if you know this, but Asian immigration was illegal. And in fact, it was illegal it was completely banned between 1924 and 1965. And before the 1920s, Asians were subject to mass lynchings, mass terror. It was really terrible to be here if you're Asian. And so I came here. My parents emigrated from Korea to study in the 1950s, which was the only way they could come. They were, they were students, so who fled the Korean War. And when I was born, it was Jim Crow Atlanta. Georgia had 0.002% Asian population. And then we moved to Ohio when I was 4, and Ohio had a 0.02% Asian population. So there's a lot of history. I have a lot of experience with overt racism when I was growing up, and I kept my eye on coming to New York because I thought New York would be a place where where my differences would not be so different, and where I would be able to fit in, and that's been largely true. And it's really only been since last year, since the beginning of COVID, coming on, Trump's calling, the COVID, the Wuhan flu, the Chinese virus, that, we see this outpouring of hatred against Asians. And so in some respects, it feels new, but in other respects, it feels like something that I've experienced that's very familiar to me from my childhood. And we're in a situation when I think so many Americans, they feel threatened from so many different things. There's been a huge economic crisis, and it's very easy to blame people who seem different for their problems. So anyway, I hope you are safe where you are, and but we all have to stand up, right? That Asians have to stand up. But that is the big lesson, that we can't sit back and expect the world to take care of us. We have to stand up and take care of ourselves. And in New York, in New York City, it's 15% Asian population. But there are only a couple city council members who are Asian. We only have a couple Asians in the state legislature. We're vastly underrepresented as in a political sphere, and it's disproportionate, and we have to stand up. Even though we're 15% of the population, in terms of public services and public funding, Asians only get 1.5% of social services funding, even though we're 15% of the population. And this model minority stereotype really hurts us, because so many people think that we are white proximate, that we are free from discrimination, that we have wealth. But Asians in New York City are the poorest ethnic group in the city. And very few people know this. We have vast poverty in the midst of all this wealth. And so for those people who've been, successful like me, they look at, everyone looks at me and goes, well, you're the stereotype of Asians. I'm not the stereotype for Asians. I'm an exception. I'm what every Asian parent wants their their child to grow up to be. But most of Asians don't have the advantages that I have, right? Because when you think about it, my parents came from Korea after the war. They lost everything, but they were educated before they came here. They came here. They went. My mother was in the second class of women to get her medical degree in Korea. My father was one of the top scorers in the Korean national, test for college admissions. He started at Seoul National University, but when the war broke out, and then he had a full scholarship, and he was one of the first Koreans to get a PhD from Georgia Tech. So, my path was made better because my parents did a couple of things, right? They were educated already, and then they came to America. And then they worked extremely hard and suffered all kinds of things so that I could go to a boarding school. And then I went to Yale. And so, my life was on a trajectory that was, because it's set forth because they were lucky to begin with. And so I think about the students, like and I'm sorry to be on such a monologue, but my younger son is a senior in high school. He goes to public school in New York, to Brooklyn Tech, which Andrew, I'm sure you know. It's 60% Asians there, but half of the Asians qualify for free school lunch. They're very poor. This is a ticket out. So my son has all these advantages because of who his parents are. But if your parents don't come from education, they've never gone to college, they come here, they don't speak the language, they work in a restaurant, they have 2 jobs, it's so hard to lift yourself off the ground and make progress. So that's what I look at when I see, Asians, young Asians, and I see the differences among us, and I see people who really, 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 really work hard to try to get ahead. And I also see a system that doesn't actually help. If you don't have access to money and extra resources, the system isn't really set up to help you. Andrea, where are you at school?
I'm very fortunate to attend Stuyvesant High School. So I completely understand everything you're saying, and this facade that the media has put out of Asian Americans being ever so privileged in the city, just because so many parents have sacrificed everything in order to ensure that their students can get through test prep and get into these specialized high schools. And it's that's the narrative that has been put out, but no one talks about the work that goes into it, or the lack of equity that is provided for students in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Anthony, do you go by Anthony or Tony?
I can go by either. It's all good. Most of the people call me Tony, but I'm
okay, cool. Well, I'll call you Tony then.
All right,
everybody calls me Art, so no Mr. Chang, just Art.
It's catchy, but yeah. Well, thank you for going so in depth and based on all of your experience and stuff. And one of our questions, really one of the reasons that we actually reached out to you to begin with was because of your super expansive history in New York specifically. Even on just your campaign website, you have this expansive list of all these jobs that you've worked beforehand. And so I guess our next question for you is really, given that you mentioned education from an Asian American perspective specifically, but beyond that, how has your cultural identity shaped how you address the issues that you care about, as well as which issues you care about to begin with?
That's a very deep question. And I'll say that it's an important question because, when people ask me, I'll tell you, often when the press introduces me, they say, "Oh, Art Chang, former managing director from JP Morgan Chase." And I always cringe a little bit inside because that was my last job when I was only there for 2 years. And, I have a 40-year history of working before that in all these different fields. So why don't they say, here's this polymath, right, who seems to be able to work in any field, in any profession, in the public sector and the private sector. Why don't they talk about that? We're talking about something that actually is meaningful. Like, I was a first project manager on Queens West. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar real estate development project in Long Island City. Well, I got that in the ground. I got the approvals done. I helped oversee the design. We were actually there on last weekend collecting ballot petition signatures. And, I look at the design for that whole waterfront park. I oversaw that design. I built the first phase of it, 8 city blocks, right? 2.5 acres of public parks. It was the first development in the United States that was planned for universal broadband. The first building had a T1 running to every single apartment. So why don't they talk about that? And but yeah, I'll go back to your question. It's very important, I think, to understand who I am by understanding, the story I just told about having grown up in Akron, Ohio, facing racism. I can tell you that walking down the street, if I saw a group of white boys walking toward me, that I would walk across the street, because that was often not a safe place for me to be. I also had a domestic violence household. I know that even coming from the same country, parents can come from very different backgrounds. My mother came from an extremely wealthy family. My father came from an extremely poor family. They had nothing in common except for the fact that they were Korean. So, but they were stuck in this all-white place where they suffered discrimination. I can't even imagine what it must have been like for my dad at his job. And then to come home, and he would bring that home, and it was just a terrible situation. And then you learn about, my parents had very bad experiences with, people who wore uniforms. So, my father barely escaped the Korean War, and my mother's father was assassinated at the beginning of it by Syngman Rhee's people. So it was very challenging for them. And so the police would sometimes come to our house, and they just would not tell the police anything. They say, everything is fine, please go away. And they were afraid of them. And so I learned to be afraid of them, and then, so you see these themes that kind of project forward, 50 years later, that we're still living in these same themes. And then, another one thing that is kind of a funny and reverse element is that because everybody was white around me, and also, by the way, war also plays a big factor in this. My first kindergarten teacher refused to teach me because her brother was fighting people who looked like me in Vietnam. And and I actually heard that story over time. That kind of story would come back when I'd encounter a Vietnam vet who still had a hatred of Asian people. But the importance of teachers became so apparent to me, because I think there's always this reverence, right, in Asian culture, that we respect teachers. And the teachers who were always had their eye out for me were primarily Black teachers and immigrant teachers. And they could see something, and they would look out for me. And in high school, I had the benefit of having a teacher, a Black teacher who was the head of the music department, who took me under his wing, and he became like my father. And he was closer to me than my father ever was, and until he died. And I still miss him. So we have these kinds of reverse situations, right, where I was such a minority, and I had to have I knew that my equality was based upon the civil rights movement. In fact, none of us would be here if it weren't for the civil rights movement. Because without the civil rights movement, Asian immigration would still be illegal because we would not be equal. The civil rights movement sort of forced the United States to say that the Constitution says that we are equal regardless of our race. And that is an extraordinary thing to experience. And so now when you ask me about my policies and how this affects my policies, I am so fortunate, and my mission in life is to take my fortune and figure out how to lift everybody up around it. That I have had the benefit of being able to do all these things. I've suffered through a lot of them. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I should take those mistakes and what I've learned and use them for the benefit of other people. And in particular, I would say that because I view Black people as having been so instrumental in my life personally, but also, in a historical sense, that I feel such a deep obligation to help lift Black people up and to bring equity and equality to our society through every means possible. And it's because of all the experiences that I have insights into everything. Like there is no area in government that I haven't touched and I haven't thought of. In fact, when you read the policy documents on my website, I have written about 90% of them. And I don't mean 90% of the documents. I mean 90% of the words on those documents. That those come out of my own personal experience, aided by research, and then my team has done a fantastic job helping to clarify the writing and the thinking and editing for the final publication of those. My blog posts are the same thing. I put out 2 blog posts today, one on anti-AAPI hate, and another one on objecting to Andrew Yang's comments blaming the United Federation of Teachers, our local teachers union, for the problems with school reopening. I think it's completely wrongheaded. So I write those things. So I think what my experience does is it allows me to very quickly put together different pieces and be able to look at almost any problem with some existing knowledge already. So I don't need to rely upon advisors to fill me in on the basics because I've already worked on those things. And the other thing I just would say, and probably some advice to young people, is that when you learn something by reading or studying it, you actually don't know it. You have a good idea about it, but you don't actually know it until you do it. And once you've done it, and then you start to know it. It takes about 3 years to really know anything. 3 years of working in something to really know anything. So, for me, it's I'm 57 years old. I got my first job when I was 18. I have spent 3 years working in so many different areas because I've worked for so long. And instead of sticking with the same career or the same profession or the same industry, I've crafted a journey, through careers and through professions that's allowed me to build this very unusual resume.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, again, thank you for that. But I think one of the main things that stuck out to me was when you mentioned your high school music teacher. I've been in band for the past like 8 years, so I definitely understand like the connection you feel with. It's not the same as other teachers, and especially if they're going out of their way to really nurture you as in a musical context. But kind of like this idea of solidarity with other minority groups. And so along the issue of policing specifically, I know you mentioned that your parents also had a certain distrust of police and then people in uniform, as you were saying. So I guess our question to you is how do you message around, especially with the recent rise in Asian American hate crimes? There is a certain section of the Asian American population that sees the solution as maybe increasing the police state or trying to, right. So how do you really message around this idea? Because on your website you do advocate for allocating police funding for different programs and whatnot. So how do you really message around that, and so it doesn't turn off specific people who are scared, justifiably scared right now?
Yes. Well, anybody who says that change is like flipping a light switch is going down the wrong path. Because if we do that, I mean, unfortunately, the current mayor in New York City, does that. When he decides we're going to open schools and they're going to close schools, and he doesn't give anybody any advance notice. He makes his decisions by himself without consultation with anybody else. There's no sense of collaboration. And then his decisions cover the entire city with a single decision instead of being more community oriented. And I can say this, that it is more important for the police to be on the streets in places where the community wants them on the streets than it is for me to impose my philosophy on those communities. The question is, will the police actually show up and be on the street? Because that's not always the case either. We have a problem right now with governance, which I've written about, where the police, because of the way that the city's, management structure is organized, the police are not really accountable to the mayor, right? They're really only accountable to the police chief, because nobody can punish the police officers except for the police chief. So when you have a situation like that, it's very hard to enforce discipline. So yes, if communities want the police to be there, then they should be there. And you'll see if it works or not. This notion that more policing equals more safety is just on its face false. Like, we know that the police can be useful. We know that they can be a deterrent, but you take something as insidious as anti-Asian hate. 15% of the population of 8.5 million people in this city, Asians are everywhere. How do you put police everywhere? It's not possible. How are you going to protect every single Asian person by having a police officer? Like, it's not going to work that way. This is a cultural problem. So I think people I think understand that. And so, we have this is going to take some time to figure out. Again, I think it's a situation where, again, you can't just flip the light switch and demand every community does things the same way. We're going to have to do things in ways that are in partnership with our communities. And then we'll have to take the data and we'll have to see what's working and what's not working. And if it's working, then we can build on it. And if it's not working, and then we have to have a discussion about why it's not working, then we have to agree on what we're going to try next. It's an iterative path, and it's going to have to be an iterative path. And because of the nature of this mayor, who's trained people to be reactive to him in the same way that he's reactive to situations, it's going to take some time to retrain the communities to trust this sense of partnership with the next mayor.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to quickly circle back to this idea of community and your identity as an Asian American influencing you as a politician. I think that representation is a large kind of idea at the forefront of a lot of politics recently, but there's also the conversation of representation versus actual policy, right?
Right.
So how, I guess, I'm not sure entirely how to phrase this correctly, but when you have a city that's kind of very divided over representation and their ethnic communities, how can you put policy at the forefront and like the well-being of the city as a whole? How do you push for that over just sticking to what they think would like representation would lead to the best like for their community alone?
Right. That again is such a great question and so beautifully phrased. So thank you for that. There's a, you know, I'll share with you a sophisticated concept. So in American society, and I say just Western cultural generally, you know, there's this notion of a duality, right, or a dialectic, that there's black and white, there's right and wrong, there's, you know, God and the devil. You know, we have all of these things that are oppositional. What is so interesting, and then the notion is when there's this conflict, you fight because there's no middle ground, right? Dante's Inferno, right? What is the middle ground is the most horrible place to be. So in Asian culture, I mean, again, and I have to say that, you know, I grew up in almost entirely white neighborhoods. I grew up in white schools. So, you know, I am culturally quite white adjacent, but I'm quite different too. And I think the Asian part of that really factors in. That in Asian culture, there's a little bit of this jujitsu, right? That if somebody attacks you, you don't hit right back. You might give and allow their weight to take them someplace else, right? Or there's this third place. Why do you have to have these two? Why isn't there a third place to be? So I think a lot of this to me is to say, well, you know, I know who I am. I know what I believe. The fact that I'm Asian has intrinsically shaped what I believe. I am not a politician by training or by temperament. I am somebody who is running because I offer my experience and my beliefs, and they are transparent and they have been consistent throughout my life. So you can look at those things and you can say, well, is this a representation of somebody who is Asian? And what does that actually mean, given how many different Asian cultures there are, different languages, and then we have the whole, you know, first gen, second gen divide, right? Where we actually have challenges with our own parents, right, who may have immigrated because their still mindset is very much in the old world, and our mindset is in this new world. And for so many of us, instead of saying, okay, we're going to be completely subsumed by this American white way of being, we're going to actually form some other middle place. And sometimes that feels very unanchored. It feels like you don't belong here or there, that you don't really belong in your culture or American culture, right? I hear this from so many Asians, and that's actually okay. It's a strength. We actually have the ability to be in a place where we are not any place, but we are everybody at the same time. And I think that's going to be the power of Asians, you know, going forward, is that we have this ability to look at where we sit, to look at the society in which we sit, and we can actually think in a different way about that. So, you know, my whole philosophy is that, you know, I am, you know, a person with very specific beliefs. I am a real progressive at heart because of the life experiences that I've been through, but I'm also extraordinarily practical. Like, you have to be practical to survive. You have to be practical to lift yourself up, to make progress, to work in environments that aren't necessarily the most embracing of who you are. And you have to then be able to say, well, how am I going to make the most of what I have? And how do I take the good and the bad and be able to make progress in my life and for other people? Right. That's the challenge. And that's the thing that I think that I offer to people. Right. It's not floating on the wind based upon what the political decision is going to be. It's like, what's my intrinsic belief about things? And that gets us a little bit out of this sort of notion of representation. Because yes, I am an embodiment of, 57 years of being an Asian person living in America. But I'm also, my own person. And so ideally the electorate looks at this and says, okay, well, we are tired of politicians. We are tired of people who posture. We're tired of people who say one thing because they want to, affect a particular constituency. Wouldn't you rather have someone who just kind of like says it the way that he or she thinks it is? And that's what I offer.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's like this intersectionality across like cultures and a lot of that Asian Americans experience and just different cultures, especially within the city being as diverse as it is, right? But I also find that with so much intersectionality, like how can you address having resources or someone who can help everyone or anyone within the city, or whether it comes with like language barriers or socioeconomic barriers? How can like you make the mayor's office somewhere where anyone can turn to?
The key is that intersectionality that you mentioned. When you look at our current mayor, the way his methodology for solving problems is to try to break a big problem up into each of its component parts and then address those parts one at a time. Now, if you're dealing with the car engine, that might work. With things that are static, they don't move, but people move in time. Society is very fluid. These complexities, these interconnections are really the opportunity. I'll just give you one example. Universal childcare is my tentpole issue. And why is that? Right? In one single issue, we can address the loss of women from the workplace and the challenge that women have, and families overall, but especially women have, in balancing the needs of their children, especially during this terrible past year, with the need to work, right? And we know right now that women's employment is at the same level it was in 1989, that 10 months of COVID have reversed 30 years of economic progress for women. The second thing is that we know, and we have known for years, that early childhood is the most important time for human development. It's physical development, it's intellectual development. And it is the time when you can level the playing field across children of every income level, nationality, immigrant status, it doesn't matter. We can give them adequate nutrition. We can look for signs, make sure that they're on track for development. We can deliver education for parents. Because I can say that as a parent myself, when I had two small children, I was not an expert in child raising. I learned so much from my child care teachers who taught me many tricks for being a better parent. And we can do that. And then the third thing is it's economic advancement, right? For the thousands of people who would be hired to have, being paid a living wage with real benefits and union protection, right? This would be a huge economic boost across the city in a way that very few other programs could be. And then you think about the sense of community. Like, the thing that every parent knows is that some of your deepest friendships are formed with other parents who have children the same age, who go to the same school. You're all wheeling your strollers up together, you meet at the place, the kids become friends, they form play dates, the parents start hanging out. It's an amazing thing. And so you start building community around these childcare centers They can become places where, we start delivering, relief to people, food, diapers, feminine hygiene products, so that, we sort of reinforce this sense that we are looking out for people. And right now in New York City, there are vast childcare deserts. There are 6 zip codes that have 0 childcare centers, 0. And the 6 zip codes with the largest number of childcare centers only have enough spots for 25% of the children. 90% of families in New York City cannot afford childcare. So when you think about also the parents' development, a parent who needs to get their GED, who wants to do continuing education, COVID is accelerating a lot of changes in the workforce and technology. We can start delivering, education, continuing education, professional development to people, to help them take advantage of the jobs that are going to come about, in the next couple of years. But to do that, we need to have childcare. And then childcare can be in local place. So if you're in a heavily Chinese community, and let's say in a Chinese community that speaks a Fukienese dialect, right? Why don't we have a childcare center that is Fukienese English, right? Why don't we have childcare centers that support, people who speak Creole or other languages, right? New York City has, right, dozens of different official languages. There's no reason why we can't support all of those in a culturally appropriate way. So I think it's a really an amazing opportunity. I'm very excited about this. There have been bits and pieces that have been done before, so we get to knit those together. We have universal pre-K 4 and universal pre-K 3 that's just begun, so we can expand on that and bring it all the way down to 1-year-old, and then maybe we can bring it all the way down to prenatal care, which is ultimately where I'd like to be. So the intersections are really the place. And I'm happy to talk about them more, but if you look through my policies, they're all designed to look at the interconnectedness in everything, because that's really where the key is.
I think where that's most obvious is your policy about the arts specifically. So if you want to elaborate more on your policy and kind of what role you see art and culture as a whole really playing in a political conversation, which, oftentimes people dismiss conversations like that as just talk about whatever. But, what role and importance do you see culture and art in these political debates and these ideas being floated?
Well, I don't even know why it's a debate personally. I mean, the arts are so intrinsic to who we are. It's like, we know that, like, ancient civilizations are not remembered. Like, no one remembers maybe you might remember who the kings are, but nobody remembered who had the most money or the most prestige. In many cases, we may not even have the buildings, but we have the remnants of their art, right? The writing, the visual art, in some cases, the architecture, to remind us of what these civilizations actually were all about. And the sign of wealth in any civilization is really art. And it has been since the beginning of the embodiment of culture has been art, right? And when we look at, traditional cultures, Asian cultures, and art is a historical part of what you're all about. So it just is part of civilization. So, the fact that New York City is, the creative capital of the world is I think intrinsically connected to that fact. We have, the largest concentration of creative people in the world. The arts themselves are a massive generator of jobs and economic benefit for the city. The theater district alone, Broadway alone, is estimated to produce $14 billion of economic activity between the theaters themselves, with the actor performers and people back of stage, but also all the hotels and the tourism and the restaurants and the things that people will consume in order to get access to the arts. But the arts are also about sharing, right? It's about teamwork. And I think, Tony, you certainly understand this if you play band, right? It's not about making something that's perfect. It's about making something that is perfect together with other people. And there's a give and take there, because no two performances are exactly the same, right? Because people are all human, and one night is better than the next night, and one night is great and another night is great in some different way. So understanding, it teaches you how to work in teams. It teaches you that give and take. It teaches you how to make success out of something where someone has made a mistake and the whole group just keeps going, and they help that person. That's an amazing experience. And then just fundamentally, we know, like, all of our learning tells us that, music and the arts are additional forms of intelligence. Like, so why do we measure only reading and writing and math? Why aren't we measuring visual skills and design skills, design thinking, thinking musically, being able to translate from musical notation, into something that is, audible? Like, those are amazing skills. They exercise different parts of the mind. There's a reason why so many people who play music are also great mathematicians and physicists and medical doctors, because there's that connection between music and being able to play in those other areas. So I think, it's an incredibly important part for education. And New York City has really divested itself of its investment in the arts across the public school system, and it needs to kind of bring that back. And then just finally, going back to the economic development piece of it, New York City is the size of 8 Bostons. And so why don't we have 8 different cultural centers around the city? Why don't we have an Asian one? Not just, we have obviously Flushing, we have Sunset Park, we have Chinatown, but why don't we have like a real thriving, Asian arts scene? Why don't we have indie theaters in more parts of the town, next to restaurants? Like, why doesn't the city plan these things? We can do that, right? Because there's this other thing that you'll learn about in economics called agglomeration economies, where, and this explains why, you have, when you have one theater, it actually does better when you have 3 or 4 or 8 theaters all in the same place, because people won't have to make the decision about what theater they want to go to. They just have to say, oh, I want to go to the theater. And then they attract restaurants and retail, and it all becomes this organic thing. So agglomeration economies are fantastic economic and cultural generators and community generators. So if you know this, why don't we actually orient ourselves to that? So in the post-COVID world, I don't know what it's like, where you are in Phoenix, but in New York City, we've started moving restaurants out onto the street. We've started closing streets so that we can have, pedestrian-friendly streets, so we can do more of that. Why isn't that an intentional thing? People, there's a terrible thing where people are not taking the subway as much. But on the other hand, people are riding their bikes a lot more. So we have now bicycle traffic jams and bicycle traffic congestion, because so many people are riding their bikes. And then we have all of these micromodal ways of transporting ourselves, right? Single-wheeled electric vehicles, dual-wheeled electric vehicles, electric scooters, electric mopeds, electrified bicycles. And so, like, the future of the street is extremely exciting and interesting, and that actually plays into the idea of these agglomeration economies, right? Because you can start thinking about New York as being like this set of mini centers all around the city that start being connected by ways for people to get there, right? By all these different modes of transportation, and that they're all kind of places. Like, I want to say, well, no, like, I'm going to go to Flushing and I'm going to go, have some, amazing, Korean barbecue And then I'm going to pop down like the next block and maybe go see music, or hear music, or see movies. Right now these are too much of a single theme, right? So like Flushing, for example, is very much about food and retail, but we can expand that. We can do more with that if we bring the arts into it. And I think we can do things that also then start to tie in some of the colleges. We have CUNY, the City University of New York. CUNY, is one of the largest public higher educational systems in the country. We have 250,000 students in CUNY. It's just in the city of New York. Right, half of them are in the degree granting programs, and the other half of them are in adult and continuing education programs. Right, and so CUNY is everywhere. Right, and then our library systems are amazing. We have, like in Brooklyn, I was on the board of the Brooklyn Public Library for 3, and there's a branch within a half a mile of every single person who lives in Brooklyn. It's an amazing, like, we have all these amazing resources, and we can augment them and build onto them with a little bit of foresight and planning. Like, the future in New York can be so exciting, and it will be so exciting if I'm the mayor.
Okay, so you spoke a lot about like the arts as an economy in New York, and you like briefly touch upon the kind of arts and such programs in New York City high schools, or just the public school education system as a whole. Something I've noticed is when budgets need to be cut, that's the first thing that goes, right? Extracurriculars and the arts programs are the first ones to see decrease in like courses or just funding in general.
Right.
When these typically would be kind of what would funnel into like the future of the arts as an economy or as an industry in New York, how can we better protect the arts and better protect them as like a community building source in New York for the next generation?
It's again, asking really great questions. I believe fundamentally that the more we think about the city as a mosaic in every respect, the healthier it will be. And I'll give you an example, starting with the public schools. And then I'll talk about the city's budget. And then we'll wind around back to kind of what we do about arts as a business. So this one size fits all strategy doesn't clearly work, right? So we know that in the specialized high schools, for example, that it creates an artificial supply demand constraint for exceptional students, because we know that there are actually many more students who have the intelligence to go to a specialized high school than can be admitted. So the Shazat, in some ways, which is the way that the single test that students take in New York to get admission, is really this artificial constraint. So the question is, to me, is not how do you remove the constraint, it's how do you create more opportunities, in a more flexible way. And I'll just give you an example. So for high school students, and by the way, how many APs are you taking?
I'm taking 3 as a junior.
Okay. How are you, Tony?
I'm taking 5 as a senior.
Okay. So I think of APs as a total waste of effort. Like, if you're taking a college equivalent course, why aren't you just taking a college course? Right? Why aren't you taking a college course? Like, why can't you just go do edX or Coursera and take a course from Harvard or MIT and get credit for it in high school and college simultaneously? Like, why not? There are some high schools in New York City that are cross-registered with CUNY. And, if you take one of those courses, you get both high school credit and CUNY credit. Why don't we do more of that? So if you finish high school after 4 years, why haven't you already accumulated enough official college credits where you can shorten the time that you'll be in college. Isn't that more efficient? And wouldn't it be more exciting to take a college course with other college students when you're in high school, even if it's remote? Like, we have all these different things like the digital learning that can actually make that possible for more students. And by the way, why does, not every student develops the same way. We all know people who are brilliant at math and not so good at English, or people who are amazing at writing and not so good at math. So why don't they go into college courses for the things that they're great at? Right? We also know that some students have, family problems. They've had a death because of COVID. It's really set them back. Why do they have to graduate in 12th grade? Why do you have to graduate when you're 18? Why can't you graduate when you're 16 or 22? My dad started college when he was 22 because that's when the Korean War ended. We've in society, we have always adapted to these kinds of crises, except for right now, we're trying to get students to catch up. The whole conversation is around catching up. Why doesn't the system be more flexible? So I look at these things and I go, well, so if we start allowing students to take college courses online or in person, so they can actually, shorten their college time, isn't that a great thing? Maybe students don't need to attend classes as much in person. Maybe we can have for some students, we know some students really prefer this all remote learning. Not everybody, not most students, but there are some students who actually do better in remote learning. So why don't we have an all digital school for those students? Maybe we can shrink the number of high school buildings we have, right? Maybe we can shrink the amount of overhead we have, right, for all these different things. Maybe we don't have to pay the College Board for their AP curriculum and those damn tests, right? So when you start thinking about this stuff more flexibly, does any of this stuff not make sense? It totally makes sense. Like, if you wanted to go to do another high school course in the summer, why don't you just do that, or take a college course in the summer and get credit for it? It's, we're so ingrained in this lockstep kind of factory model for education, where you have to be of a particular age in a particular grade to basically get pumped out like a widget at the end of the system. But we're all people, and the technology and the system should allow us to all do the things that make sense when it makes sense for us. That, to me, is what the future is all about, because there are also people who have learning differences. My older son, for example, has a learning difference. He's incredibly smart, very strong conceptual thinker, but things take him a longer period of time. So why isn't there a college program that allows him to graduate at 24? It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of life, whether you graduate at a particular time or not. So there are ways to do that. So I want to talk about this in terms of the city's budget as well. So right now in New York City, and I'm sure it is in Phoenix too, everyone's talking about, the budget crisis. Every city has a budget crisis. There's not enough money. People are delinquent on their property taxes. In New York City, we have a local income tax. So we have a huge unemployment rate. And so people are not going to, there's the taxes from that are going to go down. And everyone's talks about this crisis. And so everyone in schools is like afraid that we're going to lose our education budget. But think about this, New York City's budget grew from about $70 billion in 2013 to over $92 billion this year. That's $22 billion in nominal dollars. if you or normalize that for real dollars in 2020 dollar terms, that's about $18 billion. $18 billion. You know how many units of low-income housing you could build for $18 billion? It's like you could build about 2,000 units for every billion. So we could have built about 36,000 units of low-income housing. And so we look at this, I look at those things and go, okay, yeah, so so there were some valid things that got spent. We spent money on universal pre-K4 and pre-K3. So those are valid. So that's maybe $1.5 billion. So where's the rest of that budget? Every single agency had bloat. Every single agency grew headcount. Headcount grew from about 270,000 to 330,000 people over that same 8 years. And, you know, any New Yorker, you ask any New Yorker, well, do the streets feel cleaner? Does the street feel safer? You know, have we improved our education system by 25%? Have we improved anything by 25%? And every New Yorker says, no, we have not. So where has that money gone? And I will bet you, because I'm staking my candidacy on this, that at least $10 billion of that is in overhead. That we need to slim down and flatten the hierarchies in the city government. I think we can recapture $10 billion by eliminating duplicative efforts and by streamlining services, integrating services, and being able to deliver it and reorient that money to the more of the front lines. To do things like pay for arts education, for example, or universal childcare. I figure universal childcare is going to cost $5 to $6 billion to do. So if I can take that $10 billion of excess, you know, overhead, and take half of that, well, I've paid for universal childcare. You know, my budget calls for $1.3 billion in cuts to the NYPD. That's going to be a big down payment for universal childcare. And then, by the way, Biden is now proposing a budget that includes universal pre-K. That pays for half of my childcare program, right? Calling for a large increase in affordable housing and low-income housing in particular. So the things that we know we need to do are right now being backed up by the White House. So we can do those things, but it means that the city government has to be led by somebody who thinks about things in a much more efficient way, because it will result in better services at lower cost. Like if you are a restaurant owner in New York City, you are regulated by 8 different city and state agencies. 8. They are not coordinated. So you think about the number of people on the amount of effort it takes to regulate a restaurant. Why isn't it just 2? Why isn't all of it done online? Why isn't all of this stuff streamlined so that it's much easier for a restaurant owner? And then why isn't the city thinking about how you help small business people do better? I don't know if you know this, but during COVID, the businesses that got hurt the most are Asian businesses. In New York's Chinatown, retail sales went down by 98% in the first month after COVID, after the quarantine, and in Flushing, 80%. And in the rest of the city, it was 65%. And our Asian communities have still not rebounded. Everyone thinks about Asians as being very techy, but the vast majority of Asian businesses are behind the curve in terms of digital technology. The business models are outmoded. So it's been harder and slower for these small businesses to catch up. And then the small businesses, like, were not prepared for a pandemic. So if you had a business owned by a person of color in New York City, only 50% got PPP, because the businesses didn't have the corporate structure, the tax documents, the employee documents that allow them to qualify for government relief. So you have to ask yourself, well, what the hell were the previous administration doing? Right? How many business schools do we have in New York City? Why isn't every business school student given a real life case study to go out and adopt 10 small businesses and help them come up the curve, right? I'm proposing an innovation core of entrepreneurs and experienced business people to go in and actually work with these small businesses to help them modernize so they can withstand the next crisis and dig their way out of the current one. You know, it's shameful how, you know, in a time of prosperity, you know, we have had a city that hasn't used that money to enhance the people who are at the bottom and help them build. And instead, we're just focused on adding overhead and power, because in people who are oriented toward power, you know how they count their power if they can't count it by money? They count it by budgets, and they count it by the number of people who they supervise. And that's true in large companies, and that's true in government. So, you know, you need a mayor who is not going to be interested in the traditional metrics of power, but instead be interested in the metrics for success. How many students, how many college credits will students have when they graduate from high school? How many, what will be the lifelong earnings for people who graduate from New York City High School or from the high school in Phoenix, right? What are the life outcomes? What are the, you know, are we going to prevent obesity and diabetes in our population? If you go to school in New York City, you know, I would like to see that we lower the incidences of diabetes and obesity, because students know that how important nutrition is and what it does for them, and they're taught how to make food, and it's taught how to make those kinds of decisions. Right? We have to look at the world in a completely different way, because everything is interconnected.
Right. And yeah, I think on that note here, it looks like we're just coming up on just over an hour here. So before we conclude and everything, just you want to take like a few minutes to just plug everything from your social media to ways to get involved with your campaign. You know, any shameless plugs that we'd be more than happy to promote.
Well, thank you. I will make one more substantive comment though. And it was something I tell every group of young people. You know, my generation really, you know, fucked it up. Like, we left you holding a crappy world, and you know, it's our job to compensate for that. And so, on behalf of my generation, I want to say I'm sorry. I apologize. I look out. You want your politicians to have the longest time frame. Right, we've seen the terrible fires in the West, the hurricanes in the Southeast, the freeze in Texas. Climate crisis is happening. Climate change is upon us right now. In 30 years, in 80 years from now, by 2100, the seas could rise by as much as 10 feet. And if that happens, all of our coastal lands will be underwater, right? New York City, hundreds of thousands of people in New York City the homes will be underwater. All of our wastewater treatment plants, our airports, the entrances to bridges and tunnels. And if you live next to a river, that will go up. The violence of the storms are going to increase. The likelihood of devastating storms is only going to increase over time. So you have to have politicians who are going to say, okay, I may be elected for 2 years or 4 years or 8 years, but it's my responsibility to plan for 80 years from now. Because when you're thinking about things like whole cities and communities and airports and water systems, it's not too early to start thinking about those things. It's going to take a long time to figure out what we're going to do. So we have to start those discussions today. And there's a sense of urgency about this for me, because if we don't start it today, then it's not going to, then, you know, in 60 years from now, you guys are going to go, okay, you know, my kids, those will be your kids then. we'll have 20 years to figure out how to fix the problem. And by that point, it's like not like a switch again. It's like gradually going up and worse and worse and worse. So how do you actually address it? You have to start today. And I'm absolutely insistent about this fact. And your politicians have to be looking out that far. And if they're not, you have to protest. You have to demand that they have to look ahead, because it's your future at stake. So I'm not going to make a long pitch for my website. It's very simple: Chang.nyc, Chang.nyc. I'm incredibly accessible. Yeah, on my website, you can book a time to meet me via Zoom. I have Zoom open office hours, 7 days a week. I've had students from all over the country come and meet me, as well as adults as well. So anyone is welcome to come meet me. My website contains all my social media, so we're very active on social media. If you are part of Clubhouse, I'm also very active on Clubhouse, so please follow me there. I just want to say, thank you guys for this opportunity to, share my thoughts with you. I hope it's been useful to you, and inspirational for you as you think about your futures, because you're really the next leaders of the next generation. And so really an honor to speak with you.
No, thank you, Art. We appreciate your time. We know a campaign for mayor is certainly not leave you with a ton of free time. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us here.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially running for mayor in a city this large with so many constituents to look after and people to consider for it. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your story.
You're welcome. I hope to see you again.